Hi, everyone. I'm Lukoff, a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Washington in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. And today I'm delighted to present my dissertation defense on designing to support sense of agency over time spent in smartphone apps. So computers are everywhere in our modern environment, and this offers great benefits in the form of ubiquitous and personalized access to information, communication, and entertainment. However, this constant access to computers also means that the temptation for distraction is always with us. One useful way to define temptations is as desires that conflict with a person's long-term goals. And people often attempt to resist such temptations, but they sometimes fail. So for example, when people attempt to resist temptations such as smoking, drinking, and shopping, they fail around 30% of the time. However, the temptation with the highest failure rate of all is media use, where people fail about 75% of the time. Let me just shift this Zoom window. And with a computer in our pocket, the temptation to engage in media use is always with us and hard to resist. Now, of course, the attention economy, the practice of monetizing people's attention, arose over a century ago with newspapers and radio. But smartphone apps dramatically enhanced the arsenal of attention merchants. First, because of the high rate of smartphone ownership and the close proximity of these devices, apps can capture attention at nearly any time and any place. Second, apps can target highly specific demographics, for example, female MMORPG gamers in New York City that would have been difficult to reach in the past. And algorithms can then leverage this granular tracking to target content and ads that seduce the individual user or prey on their individual frailties. The result is that digital technology use is associated with a number of attentional harms, from distractions when driving and socializing to a loss of productivity and sleep. And individually, these short-term costs may seem small, but given the amount of time that we now spend online, these costs can add up to undermine people's goals and values. Now, technology companies want people to believe that their inability to control their technology use is due to their lack of willpower. However, the reality is that companies are purposefully developing technologies that exploit psychological vulnerabilities to capture our attention. For example, in the popular game Farmville, when you attempt to leave the game, you are notified that your crops will die unless you return within 2 hours. On this ad, there's actually a fake hair, and when the user attempts to brush it off, they actually click on the ad. And these kinds of designs can be called dark patterns, user interfaces that are intentionally designed to trick users into doing things that go against their best interests. So far, designers have documented dark patterns that cause financial harms, privacy harms, but there's actually been very little about the category of what could be called attentional harms. And my work systematically examines attention capture dark patterns and looks at how they operate across a variety of different interfaces and social media apps. So, given all these user frustrations with the loss of control, what should designers actually design for? Well, in my dissertation work, I focus on sense of agency, the experience of control over one's actions and their outcomes. Now, sense of agency is a promising lens for understanding and designing for digital well-being because, first, providing sense of agency is a heuristic for good design in many HCI guidelines. And it's still unclear how to actually achieve this, though. Second, high sense of agency is associated with positive technology use outcomes. And third, sense of agency matters in its own right for overall well-being in life. My investigation of the digital environment that fosters such loss of control has led me to 3 thesis statements. First, existing screen time tools provide insufficient control for users to target the specific experiences within mobile apps that they find problematic. Second, we can identify specific design features within apps that have predictable effects upon sense of agency. And third, by designing adaptable interfaces, we could support the user to choose the right level of sense of agency for their use case. Before we take a critical look at how technologies capture attention, I want to introduce the methods I use as a researcher in the field of human-computer interaction. So here's my typical process of HCI systems research. I start by understanding user needs because we want technologies that reflect our human needs rather than asking people to adapt their needs to the technology. And here I use methods like data-driven interviews and experience sampling. Then I move on to design, where I brainstorm and prototype a wide range of possible solutions. And at this stage, I use methods like co-design and prototyping. Next, I build technologies such as mobile apps and browser extensions that explore generalizable solutions for addressing user needs. And finally, I evaluate these technologies in experiments or field deployments to see if they actually support sense of agency in the wild. And throughout my work, I've actually authored a number of publications at different venues in human-computer interaction, and those form the basis of my talk today. Now, of course, the process is not actually as neat and as linear as this. Instead, it might look something like this. I'll design something and realize that it doesn't actually meet user needs, so I'll return to the step of understanding user needs and then build something and learn some more and so forth. But fear not, today I'm going to present you with the linear version of this story for the sake of clarity. So in today's talk, I'll follow the HCI process of systems research to address 3 thesis questions. The first thesis question is, what app use makes people feel a loss of sense of agency? What are the contextual factors that contribute to this problem? The second is, what design features within apps can we change to support sense of agency? How can we not only remove problematic features, but also replace them with features that support a greater sense of control? And third, do alternative versions of these apps support control in the wild? And testing with real users is important to test the feasibility and effectiveness of solutions. So let's start with the first research question. What app use makes people feel a loss of sense of agency? Now, smartphone users often describe how the apps they use are pleasurable, but that they can distract from their higher goals. For example, checking on those dying crops in Farmville might be fun, but could take time away from a lunch with friends or a challenging programming assignment. Now, one way to understand the problem is through the Aristotelian lens of virtue ethics. Many smartphone apps appear to be excellent at providing hedonia, or maximizing what feels good right now, but the Greek philosopher Aristotle proposed that eudaimonia, or growing through challenging experiences that bring meaning, is also a necessary component of well-being. Now, in today's era, how can we create digital environments that support meaningful experiences and digital well-being? So in work that I published with my colleagues CCU, Julie Kientz, and Alexis Hineker at the conference UbiComp, we asked, what makes smartphone use meaningful or meaningless? Prior research on this topic has relied mostly on user interviews, but in our work, we realized we could use the experience sampling method in which participants respond to a short survey at the exact moment of interest. And in our case, that was right at the time of smartphone app use. And this method has a couple of advantages. We could capture a large range of samples. We could reduce recall bias, as people don't have to rely upon their memory to describe their experience. And we compare subjective data from self-reports with objective data from app logs. Now here's a diagram of the actual study protocol. Our study app detected when the study participant opened the study app on their phone, or opened an app on their phone, and randomly selected one of 3 different timings, at the start of app use, during app use, or at the end of app use. at which point it asked a question like this one. How much do you feel like you've spent your time on something meaningful on a 7-point scale? And then it waits at least 30 minutes before sampling that user again. So we collected 86,000 samples of app use from 45 Android smartphone users. And at the end of the study, we conducted data-driven exit interviews with 11 participants. In these exit interviews, we presented participants with their log data that showed that they had used their, how they'd used their phone and how they had scored it for meaningfulness. So for example, we showed participant number 45 here, that on January 2nd, they used WhatsApp for 10 minutes and rated it as a 7 out of 7 for meaningfulness. And in the interview, we then asked them why they had rated the app this way. And using this method, we were better able to understand the why behind the behaviors and attitudes of study participants. So what types of app use did participants find meaningful or meaningless? Well, productivity was found to be mostly meaningful by participants. And here one participant explained that they had rated the Slack app as a 7 out of 7 for meaningfulness, saying the Slack app is meaningful in that way because it helps me get work done easier. Now, communication was another type of app use that was seen as meaningful most of the time. And one participant said, I didn't speak to my daughter for at least 5 days. Then yesterday, she finally talked to me on Facebook, so that's why I put a 6 out of 7 for meaningfulness. When asked what type of use they found less meaningful, participants highlighted passive social media use. So whereas on the previous slide, a participant used Facebook for communication and rated it high for meaningfulness, here another participant used it passively and rated it low. They said, going to Facebook just to browse and not doing anything else, that's pretty much meaningless. Entertainment use was also experienced as less meaningful. Another participant shared, I would say any time spent on that game was meaningful. It's just a way to entertain myself mindlessly. So here's the aggregate data. We can look at meaningfulness on the y-axis, and we can see that productivity, information, and communication all averaged above a 4 on our 7-point scale for meaningfulness, whereas entertainment and social media averaged below a 3.5. So this data told us about the averages, but we also found a lot of variation in the data. And the same type of app use was found to be sometimes meaningful and sometimes not. So for example, one father often played the game Candy Crush on his phone, which he usually rated low in meaning. But in this case, he actually rated the game as a 7 out of 7 for meaningfulness, and he explained in this quote, you can't step outside for a minute each time it gets hectic because it's always hectic with 3 children. So I use Candy Crush to uplift myself and relax. So in other words, Candy Crush was sometimes meaningful as a relief from stressful situations. Finally, another major theme that came up over and over again is that participants felt a loss of control that led to negative effects. And here one participant described one such example of unconscious phone use. Even without realizing it, I pulled out my phone and just started mindlessly checking my email. When I put it away, I realized, oh, I feel bad for ignoring my friends. So what are the takeaways from these results? Well, first, meaning depends upon context. So the same type of use is not always a reliable indicator of meaningfulness. So for example, the father I mentioned in our study usually found entertainment meaningless, but sometimes used Candy Crush as a relief from stress. Similarly, knowing the app is not a reliable indicator either. For instance, Facebook was found to be sometimes meaningful and sometimes not. And second, a loss of control led to meaningless use. And we could see that for these participants, sense of control or also sense autonomy or sense of agency were central to well-being beyond just leading to meaningless use. And so far, concerned practitioners and researchers have responded with screen time tools that now come pre-installed on every single Android and iOS device. And here you can see Apple's screen time app and Google's digital well-being. But one implication of my findings on meaningful app use is that these tools are really too crude. They use external features to block access to apps, for example, lockout mechanisms and timers that function the same way across all different kinds of apps, as you can see in these two examples on the screen. But my own work finds that if you block certain types of apps or types of use completely, you will also end up indiscriminately blocking access to meaningful experiences for users. So what can designers or developers do instead? Well, one alternative approach is to change the design of internal features within apps rather than blocking apps altogether. And so that means actually identifying the features within apps, such as recommendations, autoplay, and search, to understand which ones support or undermine sense of agency. And that's precisely the challenge that I addressed in my next research. So now that we've gained an understanding of user needs and identified an alternative approach to current screen time tools, this brings us to the question of what design features within apps can we change to support sense of agency? So in work that I published with my colleagues Ulrich Lings, Hamachi Zhang, Vera Liao, James Choi, Kai-Yue Fan, Sean Munson, and Alexis Hinneker at Kai 2021, I decided to focus on YouTube and ask, what design features influence sense of agency in the YouTube mobile app? I chose YouTube as a test case because first, it was actually one of those apps that was found to be meaningful and meaningless at different times in our first study. And second, it has similar features to many other social media apps, such as recommendations, autoplay, and search. And third, it has a public API that we could use to build an alternative client for watching YouTube videos. So stay tuned about that. In our first study, we wanted to understand which existing features within the YouTube mobile app influence sense of control. And to investigate this question, we conducted a survey with 120 participants, all YouTube users from across the US. And our primary question was this: what are 3 things about the mobile app that led you to feel least in control over how you spend your time on YouTube? And conversely, we also asked, what are 3 things about the mobile app that lead you to feel most in control of your time on YouTube? We then established a codebook that multiple coders could apply with a high degree of iterator reliability and analyzed which features contributed to sense of control. And this diverging bar chart shows the results. And they're ordered according to which design feature was mentioned most frequently by respondents. So you can see the features that primarily led respondents to feel least in control were recommendations, ads, and autoplay. And the features that primarily led participants to feel most in control were playlists, search, subscriptions, watch history, and play controls. So let's look at how recommendations led participants to feel less in control. One survey participant said, I have a hard time not looking at the suggested videos that the algorithm picks for me. I almost always justify watching just one more video. On the other hand, let's look at one example of a feature that made survey participants feel more in control: playlists. One participant wrote, I can create playlists or queue videos in advance to limit what I watch to a specific list instead of endlessly searching around for what I want. In addition, participants also noticed that playlists had a natural stopping cue when you reached the end of the playlist, and that served as a signal for them to finish their session of use. So in our second study, I wanted to understand what changes to the features of YouTube might increase sense of control. And to investigate this question, we conducted 2 co-design activities with 13 YouTube users. And the first co-design activity was a sketching exercise where we asked participants to sketch one version of YouTube that will give them less control over their experience and one version that will give them more control. So you can see in the version for less control, it's plastered with video recommendations and the search bar is hidden off the bottom. In the version for more control, the search bar is moved to the top and there are fewer or more limited recommendations. And the second co-design activity was that we asked participants to evaluate mockups of versions of YouTube with different levels of control and describe which one they preferred and why. So for example, here we created 3 different versions of how recommendations might display, one with low control where there were unlimited recommendations, one with a medium level of control where participants could see some recommendations and then click to show more, and one version with high control where there were no recommendations, just a search bar. And the first finding in our co-design was that recommendations were also a top concern with the survey participants. They expressed frustration with their inability to customize their location, quantity, and content. This was the case in particular when participants found that recommendations were too tempting in that they conflicted with one of their other goals. So one participant said, when I'm tempted but know a video is not educational, I can hide it using the not interested button. So in this case, the participant is actually reappropriating this not interested button and using it to say, this is really interesting, but it conflicts with my goal to watch more educational content, for instance. The second major finding from our co-design is that when participants reviewed the different versions of our own sketches and their mockups, of their sketches and our mockups, they were often conflicted about how much control they actually preferred to have. And it depended upon the use case, and they preferred different levels of control for each. So for instance, one participant said, if I have a specific goal, I know what I want, I don't need recommendations to guide my search, I just want to be in control of my search. If they did not have a specific intention, a participant would say something like, if I just want to watch something that gets my mind off of things, I prefer the one where I can choose to show more recommendations. So for different use cases, participants preferred different levels of control. When they had a specific intention in mind, such as solving a Rubik's Cube, they preferred more control. And when they had no specific intention, they were just bored or they wanted to pass the time, then they preferred less control and they wanted YouTube to take control for them. So what are the implications for design? Well, based on these findings, what might we actually change about YouTube to increase sense of agency? Well, one design implication is to provide different levels of sense of agency for different situations. So for example, when the user does have a specific intention, the designer can present a search-first interface. On the other hand, when the user has no specific intention, the designer might present a recommendations-first interface. And switching between these two interfaces might be either done manually by the user or automatically by the system itself. The second implication is to help the user make a micro-plan, which we define as a lightweight plan that guides behavior for a short time, usually just a single session of use. And the playlist feature in YouTube helped users make a plan and create a clear stopping cue for ending their session. By building in features for micro-planning and making them more prominent, apps can also support a greater user sense of agency. So to recap, the takeaways from our study of the features within the YouTube app were, first, we gained knowledge of the self-reported effects of different features, undermining control were recommendations, ads, and autoplay, supporting control were playlists, search, and subscriptions. Second, we learned that for designers, it's important to help the user make micro plans. And third, it's important to give the user different levels of controls or different levels of sense of agency for different situations. So armed with the knowledge of specific design features within apps that affect sense of control, can we build and evaluate alternative versions of these apps that support sense of agency in the wild? So one of the key design implications of our work with YouTube users was to provide different levels of sense of agency for different situations. So we decided to use that YouTube API to build, deploy, and evaluate Switch To, an app that lets users toggle between an explore mode and a focus mode when watching YouTube videos. And this has worked together with my colleagues Ulrich Lings, Karina Shirkova, Ravina Rao, Larry Tien, Himanshu Zaid, Sean Munson, Alexis Hineker, that we plan to submit to CHI 2023. And switch to is an adaptable commitment interface, or an ACI for short. It's an interface that commits the user to avoid distractions, but can also be easily toggled off. And this actually raises a set of competing hypotheses. So on the one hand, switch to might provide the best of both worlds by letting the user choose the right level of sense of agency for their situation. But on the other hand, this adaptability might make it too easy for the user to switch on temptations and override their commitment. And we posed two research questions. First, when and why do people actually switch within an adaptable commitment interface? Will users switch to meet their situational needs, or will they always just switch and turn on temptations? And second, how does an ACI influence user experience metrics? So in particular, we looked at sense of agency, the same construct we've been looking at in the previous studies, as well as satisfaction and goal alignment. And we started this work with an eligibility survey. Oh, that shouldn't have appeared yet. And we recruited 606 YouTube users from across the US. And we asked, what, if anything, respondents wanted to change about their YouTube use? We found a bimodal distribution where 40% of participants were actively trying to change, 8% were preparing, 3% were contemplating, 4% were contemplating, and 3% were in pre-contemplation mode, and 45% were maintaining their current behavior. In terms of actual goals for change, we found that 5% of goals were about increasing time spent on YouTube, 37% were about decreasing time spent on YouTube, and 28% were about increasing a specific type of content, or shifting consumption really from one type of use to another, so towards, say, for example, educational content. And then 23% were about decreasing a type of content or shifting it towards, away from, for example, recommendations. 2% were about increasing awareness, and 8% were other goals. And then we had 46 participants who actually went on to complete the full SwitchTube study deployment. And we invited these from the eligibility survey for participants who were at the action or the preparation stage of change. And these were heavy YouTube users who generally spent a median of 87 minutes per day on YouTube. So now let's watch a short demo video of the SwitchTube study app. So SwitchTube is an Android app for research study. It studies how design patterns affect the user experience of watching YouTube videos. And participants experience 3 different versions of the app: Explore, Focus, and Switch. So in the Explore version, which was designed to undermine user sense of agency, features are similar to the official YouTube app. So you can see that the homepage is actually recommendations first. And the search results return entertaining results. Oh, let's see. Restarted the video here. Let me jump forward. So in the Explorer version, you can see the homepage is recommendations first. And the search returns entertaining results. Try it one more time. So I wanted to highlight those entertaining results are about, for example, burning car tires when you search for how to fix a flat tire. And it also shows other video recommendations below that. And when the video finishes, the next video starts autoplaying immediately. In the Focus version, which was designed to support user sense of agency based on our prior research, the homepage is search first. And the search page returns relevant results. And there are no video recommendations and no autoplay on the current video that plays. In the switch version, the user can toggle back and forth between explore and focus mode. See the toggle there at the bottom. So that's the SwitchTube study app. And here's the protocol for a within subject study design. Participants first installed SwitchTube on their phone, and then they were randomly assigned to either the Explore or the Focus version. And the Switch version always actually came last because we wanted to understand when and why participants chose to toggle between Explore and Focus after having experienced each. And each condition lasted for 1 week. So in experience sampling, participants then answered questions for this, such as, for this SwitchTube use, how much do you feel in or out of control? And at the end, they participated in a data-driven exit interview. As a best practice in open science and to hold ourselves accountable against the temptation of hypothesizing after seeing the results, we publicly pre-registered our hypotheses using the open science framework before looking at the data. So how did participants actually use SwitchTube? Well, in these charts, you can see the values for each of the 46 different participants in our study across the 3 different conditions. And in terms of time spent, participants actually spent more time in the focus version than in the explore version, to our surprise. And one factor here is that participants actually spent more time with each individual video watched in the focus version than in the explore version. Video watching was primarily driven by recommendations in explore and by searches in focus. So you can see that in terms of homepage recommendations, explore is significantly higher here than the focus and switch versions. And also the same for the related videos that appear beneath the current video. And then in terms of the search results, you can see that the focus version actually far outpaces the other 2. But the switch was generally somewhere in the middle, indicating that participants didn't just use one version or the other when they were in switch mode, but they seemed to have a profile that sort of was in between both the explore and the focus version. So our first research question was then, when and why did participants toggle between the focus and the explore mode in switch? And we here looked at 4 different use cases that arose from the logs and the exit interview data. So the first was that switching was driven by curiosity about feature differences. So for example, one participant said that when they first opened the app, I went back and forth a little bit just to see if anything was added to either one of them or which one offered more. And then second, switching was motivated by curiosity about new content. And one participant said, I would occasionally switch to explore to see if there was anything popular. It was how I discovered The Weeknd released a new song. But for the most part, I preferred to stay in focus. And third, switching was also driven by addressing situational needs. And so one participant said, if I'm searching for something like flat tire, I go with the focus version because that definitely seems more educational, and explore is definitely more for entertainment. So that was the example that you saw in the video demo. And fourth, a final and unanticipated use case was actually that participants frequently toggled between focus and explore within the same session. And one participant said, I used focus to search for a particular video, and when I was done watching, I would turn on explore sometimes. When I felt like looking for recommended results underneath. Our second research question was, how does an adaptable commitment interface affect user experience metrics? At first, we looked at sense of agency, how much participants felt in control of their use of the app. And our hypotheses were that switch would provide the best of both worlds, followed by focus, followed by explore. And our actual results found that both switch and focus were rated significantly higher than explore, according to a pairwise Wilcoxon sign rank test with a correction for multiple comparisons. And in the chart, you can again see average value for each of the 46 participants' responses according to our ESM questions. And our hypotheses about which designs would support sense of agency based on the research in the previous study were mostly supported here. And one participant said, in Explore, I felt like I had no control because it was only the videos that were on there and the search was not working very well at all. So I was limited to what somebody else chose for me. Next, we examined satisfaction, where we wanted to look at how much participants felt satisfied in the short term by their use of the app. And our hypotheses were that Switch would again be the greatest, but we thought that Explore would actually rank higher or be rated higher than Focus because recommendations would provide some of that short-term satisfaction for users. Our actual results, though, found that Switch was ranked higher than Focus, and Focus was actually greater than Explore, or ranked higher than Explore. And so here participants said some quotes such as, Switch did satisfy my needs more just because I had the option to switch between the different modes. Even if you don't use it, having the option is always good. Finally, we examined personal goal alignment, how much participants felt that the app supported their personal goals. And our hypotheses were Switch, followed by Focus, followed by Explore. And our actual results found that Switch and Focus were both rated higher than Explore. And so one participant here said that I liked how in Focus, it was just the video and nothing else. There was no comments to read, no suggested videos on the bottom to scroll through. So I feel I was very focused on that one video that I was watching. So I'll now conclude with an overall discussion of SwitchTube and my other work. So for the screen time tools that come pre-installed on every iOS and Android smartphone, the goal is to reduce the time spent on smartphone, on the phone or in certain apps. However, our survey of YouTube users, the eligibility survey, found that shifting the quality of time spent on apps is actually a more common goal than decreasing the quantity of time. Moreover, we also found that SwitchTube improved user experience metrics such as sense of agency, satisfaction, and goal alignment without decreasing time spent. And participants said that even if they spent the same amount of time in Focus and Explore, that time was usually better spent in Focus. And then the term adaptable commitment interface sounds like something of a paradox. How can one commit if one can easily switch away from that commitment at any time with zero cost? Yet with our Switch version, we actually found that participants reported this higher sense of agency, satisfaction, and goal alignment, even though Explore mode was only a toggle away. And we believe that Switch worked as an adaptable commitment interface because it avoided triggers for distraction in the first place. And this aligns with the emerging consensus in psychological research that people who are effective self-regulators are skilled at avoiding temptations altogether, not at resisting via willpower. And one clear design implication is that users would benefit from a focus mode, even within an app such as YouTube that is ostensibly for entertainment, but that actually supports a wide variety of different use cases and needs. And my work has also shown that the notion of screen time is insufficient for understanding and designing for digital well-being, as it's a poor proxy for what users actually want. So instead, I advance sense of agency as a lens for designing for and understanding digital well-being. However, one of the challenges that remains is that self-reported agency can sometimes actually be quite different from the facts of agency. That is to say, people, for example, will continue to press placebo buttons on the elevator that will open the doors, supposedly open the doors or close the doors faster in their apartment's elevator, even when they have zero effect. And so it's therefore important that we not only measure the feeling of sense of agency, but we also triangulate it with the actual ability of people to reach their goals, as I started to measure in that final SwitchTube study. And finally, I'm often asked this question of, how will your research have an impact given the business incentives of the attention economy? So I'll suggest just one practical step here that my work has started, which is to create a language of attention captured or patterns. And such a language would actually identify attentional harms as real harms caused by designers and communicate them to other designers, the public, and regulators. And in the past, such dark patterns have informed policy by the EU and other regulators. Yet, it's also important that such a pattern language recognize that many of the design patterns that we identified, such as auto-plan recommendations, are gray. They sometimes lead to a loss of sense of agency, but they're sometimes also actually appreciated by users. In my future research, I plan to extend my work in two directions. First, I plan to extend my current research to move beyond just the single user to address family-centered approaches to smartphone use management. Now, current parental control tools are often resisted and resented by teens. So how might we actually support collaborative management of technologies? That's the challenge that I want to turn to in my final little piece of work over this summer. And the second piece of future work is that I found one piece of research infrastructure that's really sorely needed in this domain is tools and methods for systematic app reviews. So I've actually conducted and published two such reviews of apps on Google Play and the iOS App Store myself in order to understand the ecosystem of mobile apps. And in fact, it's not just me, researchers in many different domains, such as mental health, news, privacy, conduct systematic app reviews. For example, to analyze the prevalence of third-party trackers in children's apps. But what I found is that there's a lack of open source tools to easily scrape metadata and analyze features within apps. And I've also found that there's a lack of guidance. For example, what are the trade-offs of analyzing all of the apps in a domain, a random subset, or just the most popular ones? By contrast, systematic literature reviews already have well-established best practices. For example, the PRISMA standards for reporting systematic literature reviews were developed in the health field, but have proven useful far beyond. So in the same way, I actually expect that this method of systematic app reviews could prove useful far beyond just human-computer interaction. And with that, I'd like to thank my many, many collaborators across computer science, design, information science, and psychology who have made this work possible. And unique to my home department here of human-centered design and engineering, I'd also like to thank the many, many students who have participated in one of my many directed research groups, because without you, research would never be possible. And finally, I also want to thank my parents who supported me throughout all of the years, and my wife, Satoko, and our new baby daughter, Saya. So finally, I'm also very excited to share that starting in September, I will actually continue this work as an assistant professor in computer science and engineering at Santa Clara University. So I hope to see and continue relationships with many of you going forward from the Bay Area. With that, thank you very much for listening, and I will welcome your questions.
All right, so for process, we have about 15 minutes for kind of general questions, and then the committee will send everyone who's not on the committee and Kai out to continue the conversation with Kai. It's going to be weirdly anticlimactic for the audience just to prepare you all for that as we continue the conversation and talk about kind of next steps on the document. But yeah, for now, we'll open the floor to questions both in the room and online. All right, so while folks are thinking of questions, I'll start with one that I like to ask, especially kind of looking back over your projects. Are there things that you think you did that you're really glad you did or proud of? And then is there something you would advise others to do differently?
That's a good question. So I think I'm really proud of involving lots of students in my research. And I mean, not just involving, really having them also as co-authors on the work, because I think it's made the work a lot better. It's also made the process a lot more fun. And hopefully the students themselves have enjoyed it to some extent, and got sort of a taste of what research might be like. So that's one thing that I think I was able to do very well and felt very supported in doing here in the department, and would like to continue on in actually my next role, where I don't think that culture exists to the same extent, but hopefully I can institute it or start to build it up with the knowledge that I've gained here. In terms of what I might do differently, I think in a way I wish I had have collaborated a little bit more widely, even outside of UW, and I did do some collaborations. My longtime collaborator Ulrich Lings, I think, is on the call here, and he's been a stalwart supporter of almost all of my research projects, and that's just been such a huge boon. But I think there are other folks at Chi that I met or have met over the years, such as one of my advisors, Eric Balmer, that I didn't have a chance to collaborate with, and wish that I had it if I could go back and do it again. So maybe in the future.
I guess, like, what's the most challenging thing you faced during your research?
Yeah. I think one of the most challenging pieces of this has been finding what the right construct was to address these user frustrations that people have with their technology use, and particularly social media use. So, you know, I was poking around at like positive affect, negative affect, and that was sort of too general, I felt. Then we looked at meaningfulness, and then over time, it really gravitated towards this actual sense of agency or sense of control, which I do think lies at the heart of what a lot of the frustrations that users feel. But figuring out how to conceptualize that and figuring out how to also measure that has been challenging, and I think is still challenging in some ways. But I'd love for industry, for instance, to be able to measure something like this rather than just purely rely on sort of the time on site type metrics that are currently the standard. Because if we can do that, I think we can really better support users to align the values and goals for use with the time that they spend on their devices. Any questions from the Zoom, if you want to unmute yourself and ask, or I can't see the chat right now, but.
Well, Sean, do you want, I'm the GSR, do you want me to wait until our other session, or should I ask my question now?
So I think if you have a question that you think is useful / interesting for the general audience, it's good to go ahead and ask now. And if you feel like it's down in the weeds of details of document, then it might be better to save.
Well, I think it may be of general interest. We'll see. But Kai, your presentation is so clear and clean, and you've obviously done so much work. My question has to do with some of the background assumptions for the project, and in particular, what do you make of some of the hand-wringing among behavioral economists that perhaps some of the phenomenon that they're observing are not replicable? You know, I know that in your case, you're using co-design, and then you're testing out within your design, within your stakeholder population, the efficacy of it. And I think that's quite rigorous and defensible. But in terms of some of the underlying premises of this work, like what's your thought about the possibility of replicating some of these behavioral economics work?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. It's definitely a domain that I pay a lot of attention to and that my work draws upon heavily. And I've been trying to, as I go along, improve sort of the set of methods that I use so that the work will hopefully be more replicable. For instance, in that final study with switch tube, we really took a lot of time to think about in advance what our hypotheses were, which now has become, I would say, the expectation or norm within behavioral economics or social psychology, but I'll say is still definitely not the norm within my field of human-computer interaction. And I do think that pre-registering hypotheses is one safeguard against some of these dangers around having results that can't replicate. I'll say the other thing that is important in my work in that regard is that I do try and triangulate my measures so that it isn't just, say, the p-value that I'm looking at for how people rated sense of agency. It's also the exit interviews that I do where I ask participants to look back over their interview data and then get them to discuss and tell me sort of how it felt for them to go through the experience with that app. And in that way, I can see whether those two sentiments align from both the source of quantitative and qualitative data at the same time.
Thank you.
Another question, but as you were doing the experience sampling for kind of goal alignment, do you have a sense of what goals people were centering in response to that, right? Like, are people even very good at knowing what goals they're working on at any given time?
Yeah, that's a good question. We did try and map it back to the goals or the desires for what people wanted to change about their YouTube use when they first signed up for the study. But we found that when we asked participants in the interviews, sometimes their goals were different or more local. Yeah. So those weren't necessarily, like, we kind of expected, okay, they have one goal and that'll be consistent throughout. And that was definitely not always the case. And I guess that gets back to kind of that slipperiness of changing situational needs for users. And that, you know, sometimes they may have started out with a goal of wanting to watch more educational content, but now they really need this for stress relief or just because they want to relax badly in the moment. And so I'll say it's messy in that regard. It's not quite as clean as perhaps some other domains where there's maybe clearer goals at the outset of behavior change. Such as, you know, reaching 10,000 steps. Although I think a lot of your research shows that even those domains, that's perhaps not as clear or clean as you know, we might often think, rather than it does change a lot on, depending on context as well.
Thanks. Other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I have other questions that I'll ask in the sort of committee only thing. But one of the things that I was wondering about, and Ryan, your question about replicability kind of brought this to the fore for me. Imagine that your participants had known the purpose of SwitchTube. What if they knew that it was intended to give them a greater sense of agency over how they spend their time and a greater sense of satisfaction? How might that impact the results that you would find?
Yeah, I mean, you would bring in a social desirability bias, I think. Well, I don't know, it's maybe a good subject bias where participants would want to have the researchers succeed in their mission. So if we were vested in having, you know, one of the versions always rated higher on these metrics, and then that be totally transparent to users, I think there's a lot of research in behavioral economics and social psychology that shows that participants will kind of go along and try and support that. So we did try to give the different versions rather neutral names. So focus, explore, and switch, rather than we played around with other potential names, such as low control, high control, which would make it a bit more transparent what we were doing. But we felt that focus and explore were sort of more neutral terminology to mitigate that particular risk. And participants didn't always go along with what we thought they would, or how we thought they would rate these different versions. So you can see that in those actual results, there is a lot of variance between participants who preferred some of the different versions. I can jump back to the slides there. So yeah, as much insofar as possible, I guess we tried to mitigate that particular concern of the good subject.
It's sort of a related question in that I also kind of wanted you to speculate about alternatives that you can't, possibly answer with certainty. But I was wondering what what you thought about the fact that the explore content wasn't tailored to individual participants the way it so often is in the apps that people use in the wild, and just whether you had any thoughts or saw anything in the interview data that might give you some clues about how some of these patterns might hold up or fall apart if people had personalized content trying to draw them into the things that are most enticing or most difficult for them to resist.
Thanks, Alexis. Yeah, so I would say in the work prior to SwitchTube, one of the things that we saw was that users felt frustrated both by recommendations that were not relevant, so sort of just on a topic that was felt not suited to their needs. And so I think that frustration did definitely arise in our app. But as I also showed in some of the quotes, they also felt frustrated by recommendations that were sort of too relevant or too tempting when that isn't the direction that they wanted to go in. And so my expectation would be is if the YouTube API allowed us to present personalized recommendations to the user, which it did not, although we would have liked to have done that. We would see sort of more recommendation frustration with ones that were too tempting, and less frustration with ones that were not relevant in the results that we received.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then do you think that changes, or how do you expect that to relate to the kind of strength of control of this adaptable commitment device?
Yeah, that is a great question. So actually that point might explain sort of this somewhat surprising result that we had here around satisfaction, where we had expected Explore to outrank Focus in terms of satisfaction provided, and we actually found the opposite. So I could see that if we had personalized recommendations, maybe we would actually get closer to what we had hypothesized. In terms of what you just asked, sorry, can you refresh the last part of that question?
Yeah, so much to hold in your mind at once. No, I was just thinking about the challenge that you outlined, this like really important nuance around providing people with flexibility, but locking them into their commitments and creating a system that's going to hold them to it. So yeah, do you think that getting that balance right changes at all when the results are personalized? or when the interface is personalized?
Yeah, so I think it would change the calculus a little bit in that the rewards might be more tempting of switching over. I think it would still rely upon the same psychological mechanism of hiding kind of that initial salience of the temptations in the first place, though. So I think that would still be powerful. I think you and I actually both experienced when we were developing and designing the SwitchTube app, this experience of like, we're supposed to be working on the app, but actually you hit the homepage, and even with recommendations that aren't tailored, it can be tempting to just click into, you know, what is the most juicy thing going on in America right now in music or whatever other category. And by hiding that from your field of visual perception, I think that temptation just might not arise in the first place. So it's a, you know, I'd love to run that study, but I think this concept of hiding temptations in the first place, rather than sort of setting up frictions or barriers or costs, but showing the temptation to the user is a powerful one. So I think more tools or designers should focus on this approach of hiding the temptations in the first place, rather than relying upon kind of these just-in-time interventions, because just-in-time is too late, I think, where once you're in sort of the heat of the moment, or you see that video, then locking the user out or reminding them of what they should be doing instead doesn't seem to be very effective, because it'll rely upon conscious willpower as opposed to sort of not having it arise in the first place as a temptation.
Yeah, that's a really great response, and kind of hints at sort of a model of points of intervention and where things are likely to be effective and how they might work together. And I watched way too many Taylor Swift videos because of this project. You're totally right.
All right, so I don't see any more hands, so I'm going to suggest that we applaud one more time, and then everyone else leave except the committee and Kai. Thank you, Kai, for a wonderful presentation, and looking forward to continuing the conversation with those of us who got to.
Okay. Thank you so much to everyone who attended on Zoom and in person. And if you have more questions, feel free to also contact me via email, or we could set up a separate chat as well. I'd love to talk more about this work. Thank you.